Beatrice observed the phone screen, sitting in the dim bedroom as her husband slept peacefully in the background. The light from the device illuminated her face, revealing a mix of curiosity, nervousness, and a hint of guilt. This was her first time using a dating app, something she'd never imagined doing. At 38, married and a mother of two, Beatrice led a stable, predictable life, but one filled with routine, without any excitement outside the usual. It was precisely this exhausting repetition of days that led her to that moment. It was a typical Friday night. After another day filled with routine activities, taking the kids to school, preparing dinner, and taking care of household chores, Beatrice felt a restlessness she couldn't ignore. Sitting on the couch, she saw a news article about online relationships, and without realizing it, was drawn to the idea of joining one of these apps. Just to see how it works, she told herself, as an excuse. And so, while her husband and kids were already asleep, she created a profile. Beatrice filled in each detail with hesitation, unsure of what she was actually looking for. She wasn't seeking a real relationship, she thought. It was just a distraction, an escape from her routine. She chose a discreet, unrevealing photo and soon started browsing through the profiles of men who appeared on her screen. She felt like a teenager experimenting with something forbidden, but the thrill, the adrenaline it generated, made her ignore any guilt. Then Leonard appeared, a 42-year-old man, divorced, with a charming smile in his photo. His description was straightforward, but he seemed intelligent and charismatic. Unlike other profiles, his first message to Beatrice was kind and respectful. He didn't seem to be there just looking for easy flings, which, in a way, won her over. At first, their conversations were light and casual, about common interests, books they both enjoyed, and even some jokes about daily life. But as days went by, the tone between them began to shift. Leonard had a way of speaking that touched Beatrice in sensitive places, speaking to the anxieties and desires she kept secret. It was as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. Beatrice began to realize that talking to him gave her something she no longer found at home, attention and a sense of being seen and heard. One day, while exchanging messages, Leonard suggested they meet up. Beatrice hesitated. A real meeting was a much riskier step than just exchanging messages. But the desire for that thrill, the same desire that had led her to create the profile, spoke louder. She accepted the invitation. They scheduled the meeting at a discreet coffee shop downtown. Beatrice made up an excuse for her husband, saying she had a work meeting. When she entered the coffee shop and saw Leonard waiting for her, her heart raced in a way it hadn't in a long time. He was even more attractive in person, with a casual charm that put her at ease but also made her nervous. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Leonard made her laugh, something rare in her routine life. When he held her hand across the table, a shiver ran through her, and in that instant, Beatrice knew it wasn't just curiosity driving her. There was a real desire, a longing to feel alive, to break free from the monotony. Leonard noticed her hesitant gaze, and without saying a word, invited her to leave the cafe. That afternoon was a mix of guilt and euphoria. Beatrice knew she was crossing a line, that she had betrayed her husband's trust, but at the same time, she felt more alive and desired than at any other moment in recent years. It was as if she were rediscovering a part of herself that had been forgotten in the daily routine and the responsibilities of being a wife and mother. They continued to meet in secret, each time more frequently. The tension between her and Leonard grew with each encounter, until finally, on one night in a reserved hotel room, they fully surrendered to the attraction between them. That night, Beatrice gave in to the adventure she had been seeking, without thinking about the consequences. But the double life began to weigh on her. She noticed her husband growing more distant, perhaps sensing the changes in her behavior, and her kids asked why she seemed so distracted lately. Still, Beatrice couldn't stop. She was addicted to the thrill, to the feeling of novelty that Leonard brought. However, everything came crashing down when, one day, her husband found one of Leonard's messages on Beatrice's phone. The confrontation was inevitable and painful. He, hurt and in shock, tried to understand how the wife with whom he had shared so many years could betray him so deeply. Beatrice, for her part, couldn't provide a clear explanation. The routine, the emptiness she felt, none of it seemed to justify what she had done. The relationship between Beatrice and her husband was never the same again. Though they stayed together, their marriage became a fragile arrangement, a coexistence filled with distrust and resentment. Her relationship with Leonard dissolved as quickly as it had begun, leaving Beatrice only with the bitter taste of the consequences of her search for adventure. Beatrice continued looking at her phone screen, even after the shock of confronting her husband. The emptiness she felt had not gone away, instead, it seemed deeper now, and harder to understand. She started recalling how it all began, with those first conversations with Leo, which seemed so innocent, a small escape from the dull routine that had overtaken her life. But the truth was, those little escapes had led her much farther than she'd ever imagined, and now she was left facing the full weight of her choices. In the days that followed, Beatrice tried hard to regain her husband's trust, but the atmosphere at home remained tense, and any serious conversation ended in hurt and resentment. His gaze, once warm and loving, had turned cold and suspicious. He began avoiding her, and the silence between them grew more deafening by the day. Their conversations became limited to household tasks or things about the kids, and any attempt to discuss their feelings was like touching an open wound. Beatrice kept looking for ways to repair their relationship, but deep down, she was still confused. She wanted to restore the marriage, but her experience with Leo had changed her. She had rediscovered parts of herself that she had buried for years. Even after her affair with him ended, she still felt the echoes of that adventure, haunting her. Leo had left her life as quickly as he had entered it, leaving only memories and the burden of her choices. As the weeks passed, the impact of Beatrice's decisions seeped into every part of her life. Work, which had once been her escape, became difficult as she found herself increasingly distracted, with tasks piling up as her motivation dwindled. Her performance suffered, and a few colleagues began to notice the change. Once so capable of balancing all her responsibilities, she now felt that everything was slipping from her control. Meanwhile, her husband, unable to fully forgive her, kept his distance. They still shared the same bed, but it was as if an invisible wall separated them. On those quiet nights, she stared at the ceiling, replaying her conversations with Leo, trying to understand why she had allowed things to go so far. But the answers never came. For all her attempts to explain things to herself, nothing justified what she had done or the harm she'd caused her family. A few months later, Beatrice decided she needed professional help and began attending therapy. At first, she felt hesitant, unsure how to address her feelings and the confusion that still consumed her. But over time, the sessions began to bring some clarity. Her therapist encouraged her to explore why she'd felt so dissatisfied, and Beatrice found herself revisiting moments of her life, realizing that at some point, she had stopped prioritizing her own needs and dreams. Those sessions were painful, and she often left feeling even more burdened. But gradually, she came to see that her dissatisfaction went beyond her marriage routine. A part of her had always wanted more adventure, more excitement, more than the predictable life she had built with her husband. She began to understand that her affair had been a symptom of something much deeper. Although it didn't excuse her actions, it helped her to see what had driven her. Her husband, however, was not interested in therapy. He was practical, with little patience for exploring emotions or examining the past. For him, actions spoke louder than words, and the trust she'd broken felt beyond repair. He continued living with Beatrice, but the growing emotional distance between them was undeniable. The intimacy they'd once shared seemed now like a foreign land. Sometimes, Beatrice thought it might be easier if they simply separated. Living together, once tolerable, had become a painful struggle. She knew their children were starting to pick up on the tension between them, even though they tried to mask it. The kids were young, but they had begun asking questions about why things felt different between their parents, and each question weighed heavily on her conscience. Beatrice tried to create new memories with her husband, planning small trips, arranging dinners, but he rejected most of her attempts or accepted with a cool indifference. For him, the happy times they'd once shared could not simply be revived. Their relationship had been too deeply shaken, and nothing she did seemed capable of restoring what they had lost. Leo's memory lingered in her mind, but she understood now that he wasn't the real issue. He had only been a temporary escape. Her need for something beyond her everyday life was far more significant than the presence of another person. Even after Leo was gone, Beatrice realized that her longing for a different life still remained. She knew it was something she'd have to face alone. As the years went by, the relationship between Beatrice and her husband settled into a state of quiet coexistence. They shared the same house, cared for their children together, but the love, affection, and trust had vanished. The marriage that had once been her refuge now felt like an invisible prison, a cohabitation without any real connection.